Vous dansez, mademoiselle? Vous dansez, mademoiselle?
Sacré français.
Vous dansez, mademoiselle?
Sacré français. Sacré français. Je ne suis pas seule pour soigner. Sacré français. Sacré français.
Vous dansez, mademoiselle?
Je ne suis pas celle que vous croyez. Sacré français. Je ne suis pas celle que vous croyez. Sacré français. Je ne suis pas celle que vous croyez.
Hello, R users. My name is John Kulas. Even though it looks like I'm Diego, I'm not Diego. My name is John Kulas. I'm a 20-year professor of industrial and organizational psychology, 11-year user of R for normal, boring statistical applications, and for the last 8 or 9 years, I've also been using R to wrap entire projects. So not just for analytical purposes, but to communicate the results of those analyses. And so every week I get together with some compatriots and some people who are doing similar things, and we just hang out and we make ourselves available if there's other people out there who want to use their what most people consider to be a primarily analytical platform, if they want to use it to execute their entire projects. Now, I'm not suffering from a case of well, I'm suffering from the case of a few different things, but I'm not camera shy tonight. I do not know what's going on, but I tried to access the portal that I use, the studio, to produce these weekly sessions. It's called StreamYard, the software, and so I tried to access it on my desktop, and it said I can't find my camera. Well, my camera's right there, and the other programs on my computer can find my camera. So I used a different computer. I tried my I've tried my laptop, and my laptop, same thing happened. There was no video. So, kind of a last minute wrench thrown into the works here. I definitely wasn't expecting this. Now, at the end of last week, if anyone was here at the end of last week, I had a similar issue with the camera disconnecting, but that was a physical hardware issue. It literally came disconnected, and it's reconnected now. It works in other applications. I had meetings this afternoon and this morning, and I just tried the camera, and the camera works fine. But anyway, so we'll see if we drop off early here. But I think my audio is coming through. I see that it doesn't look like there's too many people here, but if someone stumbles across this, maybe drop me a note and let me know that you can hear me at least. If you can't, there's not really much point to continuing this. It's kind of frustrating. I don't, obviously it's frustrating, but it's one of those, I don't think it's me. Really, it seems like it might be me, but I don't think it's me. Really, I don't. Uh, Tried two different computers, and so it seems like it's a software issue. Anyway, enough of that. Let's try to. Diego here, as I speak, I see that he's got a glowing aura about him. He's got a halo, and so I'm assuming I'm trying to do that loudly to see if his halo gets louder. I'm assuming that my audio is coming through. So let's see if we can get through as much of this as we can get through, and then hopefully next week I'll hear from. Hopefully I'll hear from StreamYard and we'll figure out what the heck is going on. This isn't a me issue. So every week we do hang out and we try to help people or make ourselves available if there's people out there who are interested in using. We use R as our main analytical platform, but you can be coming from a Python background as well. Those are the two primary backgrounds that people come from that might be interested in not just using those languages to do analyses, but also executing full projects. So that includes writing things like reports and papers. And for me, it's been a lot of slide presentations. So what you're looking at is a slide presentation, and I put the link to this in the comments. Every week it's available in the comments. So if you'd like to access the slides, you can. And the main reason we're here is to make ourselves, like I said, if there's someone out there that is interested in this but maybe has some questions, we want to be here for that. as long as we're not completely obsolete. Now we're on the border of being obsolete because AI works quite well for this as well. However, over the course of the last week, I've been doing a lot of AI queries with authoring projects, and I've been getting more and more hallucinations from those AI queries. So AI has been telling me to try things that don't exist, and that's a little frustrating. You know, it's funny. I feel myself being less skilled at doing the old traditional searches. Now that I've been relying on AI a little more, it's kind of, for me, I just use AI as kind of a souped up Google. Um, but I'm finding myself less skilled and less adept at actually doing those old searches that I used to be, I think, fairly proficient at in terms of finding out how to do stuff. For example, how to author things in Quarto and how to modify them. So anyway, so if anyone comes by and has questions, we're here for that, of course. That's the primary purpose every Tuesday from 7 to roughly 8, depending on how verbose and wordy and professorial I get in terms of just sitting here pontificating a bit. But in addition to being here for those questions, we also have been covering focal topics. And so the focal topic tonight, I don't know if the thumb is going to draw that many new viewers in here. It's probably not the sexiest of sexies here, but we're going to talk about fencing. And fencing really is kind of a bit of a continuation from last week's session that we did what we called a revisiting of the ABCs or some of the basics of using these platforms to author. So tonight is kind of a continuation of that. It's a topic that could be included in an ABC type introduction, but there's enough to it where it probably has enough meat to it to form its own session as well. Okay, so that being said, and again, apologies for, although it is, Diego cuts a nice, he cuts a nice figure there, so he's a sharp looking dude. Now that I see, he shouldn't have cut his hair. I think he looked much, I don't know, he looks like he could be on the cover of like a Daniel Steele romance novel or something. He could be the new Fabio, if anyone out there knows who Fabio is. If he just hadn't cut his hair. Now, he's not like Samson, so Diego did retain all of his coding skills and his superpowers. So, luckily for all of us, just because he cut his hair doesn't mean that he lost his power. He's still powerful. But All right, enough of me going off on a tangent here. Let's get to our transition into what happened last week.
Last time you remember, Rocky was almost blown up on purpose when a missile on which he was riding was sabotaged by some unknown person.
Unknown. Allow me to present my card.
Yes, of course, Boris Badenov was at the bottom of the whole thing.
Isn't he always?
But Rocky soon straightened out the missile and recovered the trucks full of upsidasium. Then one of the sergeants discovered Boris's subtle form of sabotage.
A monkey wrench.
And Boris fled for his life.
After him!
With our friends hot on his heels, the harried villain ducked through a nearby door and slammed it behind him.
Well, Boris?
Who's there? Oh, is you Mr. Big Ol' Bossman, sir?
Of course. Well, Badenov, you have failed again and again and again.
Look at it this way, Chief. I'm consistent.
So I just cut over to X to see if I put out a question to StreamYard. Did people say they have success when they try to reach out to them directly via Twitter or X? I I'm such a small potatoes. I don't think it's going to be helpful for me. I tried that last week and it didn't. I got no response, and kind of anticipating no response this week. But I did see at the top of my page, the Cracker Barrel old logo is back. Did this just happen? Am I breaking news? I can't verify this, but I don't know. That seems like that's been a hot topic here for the last few days. That'd be a curious one to follow. But we're not here for that, are we? We're here to talk R, and we're here to talk basics of using R, because that's what we did last week. So last week we looked at 6 different fundamental things that are important for kind of using these authoring platforms that we've been using. And when I say these, I'm primarily referring to 2. The traditional one was called R Markdown, and the current one that we've been using is called Quarto. And Quarto and R Markdown are both products provided and supported and developed by Posit, the company that gave us our studio, the IDE, the environment that many of us interact with R with, those of us coming from a social or behavioral science background, as is characteristic or descriptive of me, I guess, and most of the people that pop by here. So what we looked at were 6 different fundamental skills or things you should be aware of if you're using R Markdown or Quarto. So if you're trying to author using these platforms within these environments that many people consider to be exclusively used for analytical purposes. So the first thing that we talked about was just the general assortment. And so again, there's hyperlinks on these slides, and if you access them, you can check out and kind of explore on your own here. But there's some good visual examples of. There's not a lot of variety on here, so I don't know who chose these, but there's not a ton of variety. They're probably all, they work well and functional and things like that. But they all tend to have some similarity if you just scroll through visually here. And because of that, I did put a second hyperlink on this week. So that hyperlink to the types of things that you can do with these platforms. And again, this is non-exhaustive. It's just a bunch of things. I put a second hyperlink on this GIF here. And so this has a broader list of the types of things that you can present, or that you can create. So there's documents, there's presentations. And again, these categories, there's no there's no formal kind of educational accepted way of conceptualizing these things. So these categories, they're put together by Posit, but you may not think in these categories, and that's fine. So for example, when I see this HTML concept here, yes, you can have HTML documents, but HTML is also an umbrella concept for many of these things that we see below in terms of product types. So again, one of the interesting things with using these traditionally considered to be analytical platforms for authoring purposes is I kind of feel sometimes like I'm in the wild, wild west. Like there's not a lot of rule, and I love it. I just love being in a context where there aren't a lot of boundaries or rules But that includes things like how we should think about these and how we should conceptualize these things. And so these categories, you may find them helpful and useful. If you don't, that's fine because there's nothing universal about them. But there's all wikis, so I guess there has to be a category. But there's look at all these things you could do, and these aren't exhaustive either. There's so many different things you can do using these authoring platforms, and this is only Quarto, so this is only kind of the most recent one. And again, those aren't exhaustive as well. So there's so many things you can do. I have kind of intentionally handcuffed myself. I haven't used Microsoft Office products for probably 3 or 4 years in my personal work. So I still do some adjuncting, and so when I'm interfacing with universities and university students, I might access PowerPoint or I might access Microsoft Word. I never go into Excel. Excel, we could have a whole session on my philosophy on Excel. I'm not a huge Excel fan because of the lack of documentation for manipulations and operations that you perform to data. I just think it's just waiting for errors to be thrown into it. So anyway, so you don't you don't for some reason without the video, I feel like I can't look at myself, so I'm more likely to go off on long tangents, and sorry for that. I just want to apologize in advance. But so you don't need these traditional types of software that are intended for specific product types. For example, slides. You do not need PowerPoint to make slides. Papers. You do not need Microsoft Word to make papers. You can do this all within R, and once you kind of once you get in the habit of doing it, it's fun. It is fun. And it's not that much more work. And the other aspect of this is the functionality that you can add to this, in my experience, goes beyond the functionality that most people at least use within Word or Excel or PowerPoint. So anyway, I'm going to get off my soapbox there. There's a ton of things you can do just using R as an authoring platform, or Python again if you want. Technically what we're using is Quarto, and Quarto doesn't care if you're using R or Python. So you'll hear me talk about using R to author, and that's a bit more specific than I need to be, but that's the focus of these weekly sessions. So I'll probably continue to use those phrases. In terms of adornment, here we were talking about adding images to your documents. And so, if you click the link, there's a resource there that talks about how we use images. And in these scripted files that we're creating different types of documents, the way to incorporate an image is universal. It's this exclamation point and then square brackets and then in parentheses the location of the image that you want to present. Now, the square bracket information, when I'm authoring, I usually leave that blank. And one of the reasons I leave that blank is because that name, that caption, it's a caption really that you provide to the image. But that caption will look differently in different output formats. So it might, so it doesn't always, but it might look different in an HTML file versus a PDF versus a typist document. Now, like everything with this system, this way of authoring things, you can override that. So you can always, not always, well, you probably can always, but you can typically, if you don't like the way something looks, you can change it. So the default specification of the way things are rendered is, the more I use this, the more I try to leave the default alone, because the default, there's a lot of thought that goes into that. Eway, one of the guys that came up with packages in the R Markdown system that we used to use quite a bit, he had a fantastic philosophy on this, and his choices in terms of design decisions he would always recommend to err on the side of simplicity. And I've kind of grown to embrace that a little bit myself. So that's all a way of saying that you can override how the caption renders in these different documents, but there's probably a reason that the caption is rendering the way it is. And then the other thing that we're going to see on a later slide is, and there's another hyperlink here. I believe I put a hyperlink. Yep. So the many modifications. We didn't talk about it last week because we wanted to cover a few different basics, but you can modify these images fairly easily through the use of curly brackets. And so the hyperlink there shows you some of those modifications, and those just occur adjacent to the image specification. So you can play with things like width or height. You can also give it a hyperlink, and I use these frequently in the slides. When you see a hyperlink on the slide, this is all I'm doing, is I'm doing square brackets and parentheses. You can do alignments. You can add alternative text. We've talked over the weeks about the importance of that for the visually impaired. Screen readers will pick up on those alt figure caps. You can do all kinds of stuff. So the curly bracket kind of convention, we're going to talk about that tonight when we get into the focal topic as well. And again, because of the video issue, I mean, we'll see how far we get with it. But since I don't have a lot of feedback, I don't know if I'm going to go a full session on this tonight or if we might break it up into 2 sessions. So we'll come back to those curly brackets because we use those a lot with the fences that we're going to talk about. And then I found, as I was putting together this recap of what happened last week, I found a kind of neat capability that I wasn't familiar with, but is there. And that's just this placeholder convention. So anywhere in your document, if you do these 2 curly brackets and then angle bracket and then close it with those same characters, but in the middle of it, there's the word placeholder. And what placeholder does is it just puts this kind of, you've seen this before, I'm sure, maybe you've seen it in a photo gallery or you've seen it on web pages, especially those in development, but it's just a placeholder image, and it says, I'm not sure exactly what this is going to look like yet, but I want an image to go there eventually. Now, one of the things I immediately thought of was a former student of mine, Emily, and I were working on a textbook, and we just talked about kind of images and the kinds of visuals that we might want to include for cues. And we have ideas of what we want some of those to look like, but we also want some consistency across the images such that maybe they're all created by the same designer. And so we're not quite there yet. We just kind of know what we want. But for us, this might be something to incorporate. So that placeholder convention was a neat thing. I'm glad I came across it. We didn't try it last week. Maybe this week we'll go ahead and try it as we craft a brand new document. So those are the A's, adornment and assortment. And again, obviously, if we're covering the very basics, we flubbed a little, or we cheated a little bit in terms of just kind of constraining ourselves to topics that conform to that ABC convention, and that's obviously arbitrary and not important. But I think we did cover basics pretty well by using that convention. Maybe if we do another one, we'll do the D's and F's in a few months, maybe. I'm not going to do it right away, but maybe in a few months. In terms of beautification, we stayed with CSS. And so if you follow the hyperlink, there's a kind of tutorial page there that you can play with CSS and see what CSS is. What we have here displayed is a CSS block. So these are all CSS commands. I think this top one might actually be sassy CSS. So there's the traditional styling language, which is called CSS. And then there's a newer version, which is called sassy CSS. And Quarto recognizes both. And And so I think that at import might actually be Sassy CSS. But what this is saying is it's saying there is a font, there's a Google font that's available. It's called Great Vibes. I want you to access that because I might be interested in using it. And then we developed, or we created our own CSS command, which is called what you want. You can call it, you can literally call this whatever you want. It's a key. You want to be a little careful that you don't use a key that is already being used natively. And so that's why I tend to use naming conventions that are specific for the effect that I'm trying to have. So for example, in these slides, if you look at the slides, if you look at the QMD that created the slides, you'll see that I do actually have this CSS command. The color is this color, kind of gray, and the font is Great Vibes. It's this fancy looking font. Let's pull it up here. Let me show you what it is. So fonts, Google, and we'll go to Great Vibes. So this is the font. And if we actually put in, let's see if we put in fencing, I think we can do that. You'll see there that the rendering of that is the same. So all I did in my specification, in my CSS specification, was I said give it this color. And I gave it that color because it matches one of the colors on the title slide. I tend to try to stay, have a decent attention to detail with things like that. But the way that you apply it then is as you're writing your document, the things that you want to affect with the styling that you've defined here, you can use this curly bracket convention. Now you don't need to do this. You can, in the curly brackets, you can write all of this as well. So you could just put this within the curly brackets. It just gets a little unwieldy and gets a little long. And so the normal convention is to wrap this into essentially a function. So I'm saying this is, and again, these aren't the proper terms, but I'm saying essentially that what you want is a function. And so I want to apply that function to this information that's in the square brackets. And so we can use what's called bracketed spans for little bits of our document that we want to affect the styling of, or we can use fences as well. And so this word fencing is a little confusing given the topic tonight. I probably should have chosen a different word there. But so CSS is the CSS is the traditional way that we control how things are rendered in terms of the look and the feel of those things. And so that we're calling beautification. Bibliographies are important for these documents as well, especially if you're writing something like an academic paper or a paper for something like class. And so we're using what are called BibTeX specs. And BibTeX format of a citation, this reference doesn't give a full one. Sorry, I guess I gave you, oh, here it is. The BibTeX format looks somewhat like this. So there will be an entry type. Here it says at book. There's a citation key, which is important. That's the first thing in the curly brackets. And then there's a bunch of fields here to define the citation. Typically, title, author, but the fields themselves are going to depend on the type of entry that you have. You can have books, you can have articles, you can have conference presentations, you can have theses, you can have tech reports, you can have unpublished information. You can have a lot of stuff that is expressed in BibTeX format. The way that I usually access bibliography information or citation information is I pull it from Google Scholar. So there's a link there to Google Scholar as well. If you want to just look up cats, I don't know, let's see what's going on. Nutrition requirements of cats and dogs, or dogs and cats. The reason I go to Google Scholar is because they have this cite option underneath every reference. And within the cite option, they're giving you, for those poor suckers who are still using Microsoft Word, to write their papers, they're saying you can take this and copy it and paste it. For those of us who have evolved beyond that and are using this more sophisticated method, there are BibTeX citations. And so again, it's not a primary one that's shown with Google Scholar, but it's available here at the bottom of every Google Scholar citation, just as BibTeX. And that's, if you just grab that, if you copy that and then put it into a text file, you can call that up within, so put it in a text file. You don't need to have the BIB extension on it, but that's the convention. So my bibliography files usually do have the BIB extension on them, but again, they don't have to. And then you call it out in the YAML. The YAML is the front matter of your document. So it's the meta information. It says what type of document you want. It might say things like, what are the margins? It'll say what's the title and who are the authors, what's the date. So meta information, but your bibliography also goes in that section. And then within the document itself, you call out a citation by just using that @ convention. And then the cite key, again, the cite key is the first information that's provided within the BibTeX citation. So it's information, and the convention here is to do hard returns. So you don't need to have hard returns, but it's just easier to read. So if we do stack things vertically like this and use hard returns, then the first set of letters after the entry type is going to be your citation key, your cite key. So when I'm writing a paper, I just used @ and then whatever that cite key is, and it'll automatically pull up the citation. Now the formatting of it, we didn't spend a lot of time on that, but the formatting of that is controlled by citation style language files. And so there are thousands of those. So you just pull the one that you're interested in. From Zotero is where I usually get those. And we have a few sessions on that. If you're curious about that or want more information, you can look at one of the older sessions or just drop me a note and I can help you with that as well. But there's a lot of flexibility there. And then in terms of the C's, we talked about code chunks, and we're going to talk more about code chunks tonight because it's relevant as we're talking about fences. Now, I've been calling them chunks because that's kind of a legacy term, but they're the current preferred terminology, it seems, is to refer to these as code blocks. I think I still prefer chunks because the chunks can be different languages. So for example, in my source files, in my scripts, in my QMDs and RMDs, in the files that I use, the files that have the substantive information prior to rendering, I not only have R chunks, but I'll frequently have CSS chunks. And so I don't know if I want to call those code blocks or not. I think I'll still keep calling them chunks. But what you see here is R code, and I'm saying give me, just load into my environment the mtcars data that comes bundled with base R. And then once it's in my, by the way, I don't believe it needs to be loaded prior to accessing it. I just did that to take up a little more space. But then on line 3, I'm asking for an operation to be performed to it. So within that mtcars dataset, there's a variable called mpg, stands for miles per gallon. And I'm saying, please just give me a histogram of the miles per gallon of all the information within the mtcars dataset. And there you see a histogram, there it's printed. And so in these documents, the way that you use your analytical capability is you write your R commands or your Python commands as you normally would in a script file, but we include them in chunks. Instead of a long document with nothing but data manipulations and data analyses, we intersperse those analyses with communication bits. And we'll say things like, give me a chunk, give me a code, give me a cross-reference, give me a title, give me tabs. So you can have formatting of your document in addition to the analytical component itself. And there's all kinds of controls you can have over what this rendering looks like, where it's put, where it's placed, things like that. And then last week we got cut off at the very end when, again, believe it or not, tonight's issue with video is completely independent and disconnected from last week's, as far as I know, anyway. I know it seems a little coincidental, doesn't it? But I believe it's disconnected. But so I didn't quite get to I didn't quite get to the point where we're using cross references. So last week we did actually see how to initiate cross references, and again that's done through these curly brackets. So curly brackets adjacent to, in this case, an image specification. And this image is within my project folder here. So I have a folder called IMG. If I look at my files here in my project folder, I have a folder called IMG. And then within that IMG file, I have a bunch of I have a bunch of thumbs for the different titles. And I don't think there's any preview of that. I guess there is. So the title 92 is just a thumbnail for tonight's title slide. I use those for the little music intros, the little 2-minute long sessions or 2.5-minute long sessions that we have. So that's kind of the background that I use for that, and that's why there's a bunch of those in my project folder. But so within the image folder, there's this file, and I used those square bracket those curly bracket specifications primarily to be able to later cross-reference this. So the most important aspect of this for a recap of last week is the hashtag, which is important, fig, which is telling Quarto what sort of prefix to provide to the figure, and then the name of it. So I called it title because because the image itself has title in the name of it. Now the other specification that I added that we don't need, I needed just in order to, on this very kind of squat screen, so a screen with not a lot of vertical space, I needed to shrink this image down such that you could see the figure caption, which is here. That's automatically provided by these Reveal.js slides. But then I wanted you to also see the actual cross-reference. And the cross-reference is C at fig title. Now, normally in Quarto, if you hover on this cross-reference, you're going to see a preview of the image itself, which is one of the reasons to cross-reference. Now we're not getting it in this reveal slide, so if I were to go back and change, I should be able to do this. If I were to change the reveal slide deck into just a basic HTML file, let's see what that looks like. It probably won't render because that's the way that these things tend to go, right? When you're live. Hey, look at that, it worked. So you see the same content. The formatting is going to look a little different, so we'd have to play with that if we really wanted to, if we were really interested in it. But as an HTML file, the tab functionality is still there. What I really wanted to see is if I hover over that cross-reference, so again, this is my code that generated it. If I hover over the cross-reference now, it should show a preview of that figure. And yeah, it does. And the caption shows up as well. Now, this isn't all that important here, but if we were to put that at the end of the file, let's go ahead and do that just quickly here. So we'll put another reference at the very end of the file. We can make it its own slide, or in this case, it's its own heading, I guess. And we'll just copy this. We'll see C at figure title again. And I'm going to re-render that, and we'll go down to the end of this HTML file with the expectation that the preview is going to be there, which again, we're just demonstrating that it's a little more useful when it's located somewhere that's a far distance away from where the image or the thing it is that you're previewing is itself. Okay, so that's what we did last week. I'm gonna get rid of these just because I'm gonna forget the changes that we made here if I I'm going to have to push this to my repository so everyone has access to it if they want at some point, but I want to make sure that it's back in the format that people are expecting it to be, which is these neat slides. So, that's the ABCs, or one way to think about ABCs. Again, there's no universal kind of syllabus on how to think about these things, but those to me are, one, if you want to start using this more frequently, those are things that you should be aware of. Now, today we're going to talk about another foundational thing, which is fencing. Now, fences are how we isolate information within our documents. And so there's two primary types of fences. These fences are identified by three characters, at least three characters next to each other. And so there are fences that are used within code chunks. So for example, these are fences. So when I'm creating a code chunk within a document, I can use three backticks. Those are referred to as fences. There's an opening fence and there's a closing fence. The opening fence, regardless of how we use it, regardless of whether it is a code chunk or a different specification, we're going to talk about those different specifications in a second. The opening fence is always followed by something in curly brackets. So you're going to want to get into the habit of recognizing that when I create a fence, the top of it, the beginning of it, what's called the opening fence, should have curly brackets adjacent to it. Now those curly brackets can reference, in the case of a code chunk, it can reference R, it can reference CSS, it can reference HTML, it can reference Python, it can reference all sorts of things. Now this isn't really what I wanted to focus on tonight. However, I didn't want to focus on code chunk fences. What I did want to focus on, boy, I got a lot of windows on it again. What I did want to focus on are these, what are called div fences. And so div stands for division. And so the div fences that are really important for navigating and using and being kind of creative and controlling what things look like within Quarto is these at least three adjacent colons. Now, with code chunks, you always want to use three opening and closing ticks to create and to close a code chunk. With divs, with content that is semantic rather than code-based, you can use more than three. And this becomes important because when we start to nest these fences, it gets a little messy. And so I'm not a massive fan of fences, but I understand their purpose, and I can kind of, if I put on my 10,000 foot glasses, I can kind of see, I think, where they're going with this. And so they're not going away. We're going to have to be okay with using them. And so what fences in terms of colons do is they have the same effect as code fences do. They contain the information that you want to isolate. And so what happens within fences is you're applying some styling or some effect. And there's all kinds, so Quarto has all kinds of built-in stylings and effects that you can apply. As a matter of fact, there's so many that I have not yet found a good single go-to resource for a listing of all the types of things that you can do. You can do just massive amounts of things. So let's just try this one. I'm going to create a new file because we shouldn't cheat. We should create a new one. We'll say faux Diego, since I have his picture, but it's me speaking. So again, it's good practice, I believe, to just render these without a ton of just to render these without a ton of changes. So just kind of the default content that Quarto gives you for these different files, because it is possible that you're going to run into an issue. It is possible that there is going to be something that doesn't want to render properly. And so it's just better to get that feedback before you add any information, before you add any content, just because that would indicate that it's maybe a computer issue or it's a you issue. And you want to identify that before you attribute it to anything that you've written. So let's actually try that. I don't know what this looks like. I don't use border, but we'll add it to the bottom here. So the fences themselves, again, there's an opening fence and there's a closing fence. You do want to be careful with spacing. I have noticed over the years now using this that fences seem to give you less issues if you structure the content within your fences like this instead of like this. So that spacing between the opening and closing fence sometimes has an impact. But let's just render this and see what that looks like. The expectation is there's going to be a line around that content. And yeah, there's a little line. It's kind of subtle. It's not easy to see. Let me see if I can blow this up a little bit. There you can see it a little better. It's a gray line. Now fences we also use, again, these are fences, but these are fences for a code chunk. We use fences for almost everything that's done in Quarto. Those callouts, I've been using those callouts so frequently. And I think it's dot. You got to be careful. Some of the convention for the curly bracket information in these content fences. So I'm going to call the colons content fences, and I'm going to refer to these as code fences, I guess. But in the content fences, you'll also hear me say fenced divs, and I probably say that too frequently. That's a phrase that comes from the HTML kind of tradition. And again, I'm trying to be careful and deliberate about use of words when we're using these platforms to author, because hopefully the intent is that the tradition from which these things come becomes less and less important. And I know I have a very strong suspicion that the people at Posit have a similar philosophy. So the callout note, we'll just say, hey, this is a note. I know, not very exciting, is it? We'll see what that looks like. And then there's the callout note. We can use, I use fences for tab content as well as column content. So I do this frequently in, now you're going to start to see, and by the way, I remember these curly bracket specifications because I just use these so frequently. Normally, I wouldn't be just typing them. Normally, I would just Google that and I'd say columns Quarto. That might be enough. And there's a few different ways to do columns. Here you see some different options. These are a little more elaborate than what I'm looking at or what I'm wanting. So you can put content in the margins as well. And again, you're seeing the fence specification here. Now, if you're using a code chunk, you might be able to use that specification. There's a couple of things you can do. You could wrap this code chunk in a fenced div. That works. Or you can actually just use a command within the code chunk itself. Assigns. So I'm not really seeing what I'm looking for here. There's a lot of information, but it's a little more specific than I want. So I want a more kind of basic way to specify columns. So let's see. And again, there's ways. Here's what I'm looking for. So there's ways to do this that tend to work better, and ways that have given me a few more errors. Hey Max, good to see you. Yeah, I know. I'm looking better, I think. So I let my hair grow out. So the column specification that I like to use is this one. There's a layout specification that's popular as well, but I prefer to use columns. Now, one of the issues with using columns is we're going to have nested fences. And these nested fences, this is where I lose my kind of enthusiasm. So the nested fences, you can get lost in these, and especially if you follow the convention. Like I said, my recommendation is to use spaces between these. So what we have here is we have an opening fence and we have a closing fence, and within there I'm going to put additional fences. I'm going to put 3 columns, so we'll make each of those about 1/3 of the page. And so what that means, and again, you're seeing the nesting here. Now, there's a trick here that I'll show you in just a second. In order to make this math work, we can go ahead and make that 100%. You can put images in these columns as well, and the image should conform to the container size of the column. I need to draw this back a little bit, don't I? So let's put some images in there. So what should we do? Let's do a Snagglepuss. I like me some Snagglepuss. That's a good classic image there. So I'm going to copy that address, and we'll use the convention of what we learned last week. We'll use the exclamation point, square brackets, and then you see a preview in our studio. That's a nice little sign that it does recognize that image. So there you see it. We should make him look at somebody, right? So Boo Boo, maybe Boo Boo's short, so maybe there he'll be looking at him. So we'll put him in the second column. You can tell there's a ton of thought that goes into this, right? As long as it's a cartoon, that's kind of what we're looking for a second. And again, we can modify this to equal those up if we wanted to play with the height and width of those. Might as well put a third one in. So we get Snagglepuss, we got all Hanna-Barbera, so maybe Fred Flintstone. I would say one of the Jetsons, but the Jetsons they've been kind of showing on my old man TV station here, and I forgot how bad the animation became in the Jetsons after the first season. The first season animation is fantastic. After that, man, they must have just cut some corners. So Fred's a lot bigger there. We can try using a modification to that, such as width. And it should take 1%. So we'll try 1%. Let's see if Fred shrinks down a little bit there. There he goes. So that's about half size. So again, those curly brackets are great ways to specify. If we wanted a little space in there, we could add more columns. And again, this is one of the reasons that you'll see in help pages that they talk about, not for code fences, because code fences always have 3 and 3, but for content fences. For content fences, they say at least 3. So if we wanted to go 6, for example, That's one visual cue when you are navigating a file like this. And now these images are kind of a little bit in the way. So I'm going to minimize them. But so as we're looking through this little bit, I can see that my opening fence and my closing fence all have 6 colons in them. Now, great, but there's still, there's a lot of content here to kind of just keep track of. Now, what RStudio tries to do is they try to match the color of your opening and closing fence. I have found that that's not universally reliable. So it's a good idea, but even here you see that the opening fence on my 6 colon original specification and the closing fence are different colors. So you can see when you start to nest that these fences get a little unwieldy. Now, to make it even more unwieldy, there's a couple of things we could do. We could play with the width of these images, but we could also add columns in between. You can have as many columns as you want. So if I wanted to make a little space between Snagglepuss and Boo Boo here, I could add another column, and we can do 4. That's fine. Again, just at least 3, and probably just make this like 5%. There's different units that you can use. I really appreciate the percent because it's responsive to the size of your page. So the 100% goes all the way across. So the percent specification tends to work really well. Now, if I add 5% here, I'm going to have to take 5% off from the other ones. So there's 2, there's 2, there's 1. So now there should be a little space between Snagglepuss and Boo Boo when we render this, and there it is. So that's one way to play with these a little bit. The other thing, there's all kinds of things. There's all kinds of formats and layouts that you can play with using these fences. Now, the other thing that I use quite a bit are tab sets. And I'm going to do an opening and closing fence there. I'm just going to use the 3. But let's look for, I think it's literally called tab set. So it's helpful to know, the actual command. You can still find it without that. But what I'm looking for is this, panel tab set. So panel tab set will render us something where we can hide stuff within toggleable panels. So again, that curly bracket, whoops, looks like I copied the wrong thing. That curly bracket convention, and I really do think that it's a helpful mnemonic, I guess, or it's a helpful rule of thumb to just, every time you use a fence, regardless of whether it's a substantive content fence, which are the colons, or a code fence, which are the ticks, you're going to follow that opening fence with a curly bracket. So in that curly bracket, wow, look at all those tabs. Looks like Dr. Dan's computer, if any former students are watching here. I'm going to use that panel tab set, and here are the specification. I like this a little more because really what I use are 2 or 3 level headings here to define the tabs. Now in my reveal slides, I use 3 level, I'm using the wrong terminology. I use a 3rd level heading, which is identified by 3 pound signs. And I do that because the different slides within a reveal slide presentation, the different slides are identified by 1 or 2 hashtags. So 1 is a 1st level slide, it's a main category slide, and 2 are kind of less important. If we look at this really quickly, I guess I can show you the consequence of this. The consequence of this is in terms of the organization of your slide deck, and I apologize for jumping around here a little bit. But if we look at the if we look at the slide overview here, we should actually see each column heading is a first level specification. So in terms of the navigation of these slides, you can control through those first and second level headers kind of the horizontal versus vertical priority and kind of specification and ordering of your slides. Now for us and for me, when I'm navigating these, when I'm sharing these, it's not that consequential because they're just the way that they're navigating it. I have it set up so you're just gonna slide past it regardless of the level of heading that it is. So my tabs are there, but I didn't actually call them anything. So we can call the first one Snagglepuss and the second one Boo Boo. How do you spell Boo Boo? By the way, using Markdown, we'll call them Twinkle Toes. The double dash is the preferred way to write a dash. I think that's an N dash. Triple is actually, I believe, an M dash. I don't use those frequently, but once you start writing using this system, you want to kind of get in the habit of doing that. It's more important for things like journal article submissions. Now we can put those images in those tabs instead of in those columns, or in addition to the columns, I guess. So I'm just going to give myself a little space here. I'm copying these image specifications and we're just repeating them, and we'll leave Fred with that smaller width. Now that what you're going to see here, what we should see is the images themselves in this file, they're somewhat constrained by the containers that are occupying roughly a third of this horizontal page space. And again, you'll see the responsiveness if we kind of make this smaller or bigger. You see that they maintain that same relative kind of spacing. Now, we're not doing that within these tabs. So within these tabs, these images have kind of full ability and full kind of freedom to go ahead and kind of spread out however they want to spread out. So let's render that and see what that looks like. And again, part of the complication here that we get with these fences is we can nest tabs within columns, or we can nest columns within tabs, or all kinds of other things as well. So Twinkle Toes, even though he's only 50%, he's still big. Look at Boo Boo there. What a good rendering. That's nice and crisp. That's a very nice image. Okay. Cool. Well, so I was going to cover some other kind of things you can do with fences, but the not having a camera and not having feedback, other than Max, thanks Max for popping in, it's kind of throwing me off a little bit. So I think we'll call it there. And I just wanted to point out that fences are really important as you're authoring to isolate content and to apply different styling things that you want to do. Now, there's, I guess, one extra thing that we should talk about before I close. You can apply stylings within these fences as well. So if we have, let me steal some CSS here. I'm going to steal some CSS from the slides. Now again, this looks a little intimidating just because there's so much there over the course of this. It's been 2 years now, so there's a lot of stuff. I'm going to put a code chunk in here. I'm going to make it a CSS chunk. And the import font specification, this is the same font that we were using in the recap of what happened last week. I'm going to take the fencing. Where are we here? I'm going to take the fencing kind of modification. Let's change this so it's a little easier to see. We'll do our bad. Oh, look at that. Bad is kind of lilac. I haven't used that before. So we'll use the lilac color. And now I have this bit of code that says I'm interested in this font. Go ahead and grab that. And then if you see this command, you can go ahead and apply this styling to that content. Now, the way that this is typically done is we use what are called bracketed spans. So let me do it here. We'll just do hey, or no, we'll do this. Let's expand our note. So we'll say, hey, this is a note, and this is a note in a great font. So the bracketed span is using square brackets, and then again curly brackets, but then we specify the font that we're interested in. I'm going to go ahead and move this to the top of my file. I don't know that there's consequence to that. Sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't. I don't think it should have a great consequence, but generally it's probably good practice to define the thing that you want to apply before you're asking for the thing to be applied. And so now my expectation is that this information in the square bracket is going to have this styling applied to it. Now this is the way that I usually apply kind of targeted and focused styling within documents. And there's a reason that we're talking about this. We'll get to that in a second. So there you see it rendered. We should change that color, right? That color's kind of hard to see. Let's change that color. What should we do? Cyan. Let's see what that looks like. Now I'm picking all these weird colors, and that's that's kind of hard to see too. What I wanted to demonstrate is that you can also use those stylings with these fences. So it doesn't need to be bracketed spans. You could do it to larger bits as well. Now you can either do that by enclosing this. So now that I have fencing around this entire, and again, I wasn't careful with my spacing there, but you can see where the nesting really gets nasty. So now my expectation is the words in here should be rendered instead of normal, they should be rendered in this crazy font. And if this works, we'll come back and do, I think, what's a shortcut a little easier. So there you see it. So you can use these fences for stylings applied to larger chunks within your document as well. Now, one thing that I should be able to do is I should be able to stack specifications here. Although the ordering matters, so I think we'll be okay, but I guess we'll see. So what I did there is instead of creating a brand new fence, which again, when you're nesting them, they get just a little messy. So I'm trying to have two specifications within the same fence. So I'm saying everything that occurs within these columns, apply this styling to, please. And we'll see if that works. It did, so that worked okay. And just to check to see if it worked, we can change the styling here. Let's put it as just blue. And so both of these should now change to blue. It looks purple on my screen, but it's actually blue. Okay, so again, sorry for the video mishaps the last couple of weeks, but I think we covered some really good fundamental kind of foundational skills that are important as you're crafting these documents using this method. Fences are really important. and fences really permit all kinds of neat different layouts and structurings and applyings and just isolating content that you want to apply things to. Okay, so next week we'll be back, and hopefully you'll be able to see me next week. I can't see you, but hopefully you can see me next week. All right, thanks everybody.